You think you know, but you have no idea. At least that's what it feels like when the internet starts talking about the incredible turbocharged Buicks of Buddy Ingersoll from the 1980s. The Regal of 1985 and 86, along with the later Somerset Regal in 1987, still stand among the most awesome full-body drag cars of all time. So what's the real story here? Where was the car banned? Where was it not? What did it run? How did they perform? How many different versions of these things existed? Let's dive in and answer some of those questions in this video. An enthusiastic hot rodder since his childhood, Buddy Ingersoll began drag racing and wrenching on cars as soon as he was able. The greater world began to learn about this Illinois superstock racer in the 1970s. Buddy Ingersoll drove his wheel-standing Oldsmobile to 3 national event wins in the 1976 season, winning the Cajun Nationals, the Spring Nationals, and the 76 Summer Nationals at Englishtown. Despite this roaring success, it was Robert Hutchison in his 1955 Chevy that became the national champion in superstock. Why? Well, he managed to win the NHRA finals at Ontario Motor Speedway, and back then, if you won the finals, you were the national champ. Buoyed by his own success and seeking not only a new challenge but a faster ride, Ingersoll decided to jump into the deep end of the modified eliminator pool by fielding a AA modified compact Pinto. This car used 140 cubic inch 4-cylinder Ford and swallowed 26 psi of boost, backed by a clutch and a manual transmission. Supposedly, it was also packing a rear gear ratio that began with the number 6. Yowza! The turbocharged Pinto combination had fared well in the hands of Ohio George Montgomery a few seasons earlier, and Ingersoll knew he could go even faster. In 1977, Buddy went ham. He won Columbus, he won Seattle, and he won the NHRA finals at Ontario Motor Speedway to claim the Modified Eliminator National Championship. The Turbo Pinto would serve him well into the early 1980s until he decided to make his next and most famous evolutionary step. That step was to buy the Oldsmobile Cutlass Pro Stock roller of Warren Johnson, who would use the car for the 1984 season of NHRA and IHRA Pro Stock. A relatively easy swap of the front sheet metal instantly transformed the car into a Buick Regal, and then the real fun began. In the middle 1980s, Buick unleashed an unbridled assault on American racing. It was a miniature version of the Ford Total Performance era of the 1960s in that the company got involved in everything. The crux of this effort was to promote their line of engines and to revitalize the brand as one where performance mattered. Most famously, the company developed their 3.8-liter V6 into a couple of different racing versions. There was a naturally aspirated version made for NASCAR Busch Series competition and various road racing applications. There were the 1,000-horsepower turbocharged IndyCar engines, the 500-horsepower naturally aspirated Indy Lights engines, the 4.4-liter version developed for GT cars, and the list goes on. And of course, the most powerful and famed version of this engine likely ever created was the one that powered Buddy Ingersoll's Regal, only one to terrorize drag racing with this engine combination. Displacing 4.4 liters or 268 cubic inches and evolving over the years, it's not out of the realm of reason to estimate the horsepower of this little mill between 15 and 1,800. Oh, and as you'll learn, Buddy Ingersoll was not the only guy out there terrorizing drag strips with this particular engine combination. There were some subtle differences between the heavy-duty racing stuff and the street-going 3.8-liter V6 engines you'd find in a Grand National, as one would expect. Now, most everything was in the same place, and they certainly had the outward appearance of their more tame road-going counterparts, but as is the case in all racing engines, there was just more of everything in all the right places. The engines Buddy Ingersoll used were very similar, if not identical, to the engines used in the IndyCar program Buick was supporting. The difference being the fact that drag racing had no boost limitations, so the sky was literally the limit. There were about a dozen guys in the Buick Special Projects Department responsible for the initial build and development of this stuff, and Ingersoll worked closely with them as well as McLaren, who was deeply involved in the project from a developmental role as well. More specifically, Buddy Ingersoll worked with Bruce Allen. Yes, that Bruce Allen, who at the time was an engine builder at McLaren and would later go on to be one of the best pro stock racers of all time with Rear and Morrison. Allen's engine-building skills and brilliant mind were integral to the success of this project. He and Ingersoll worked for hours and hours and days on end on the dyno to develop the engine, and most specifically the fuel curve the engine wanted to make max power. The 268 cubic inch engine was rock solid, and aside from some issues with head gasket failures when the boost reached levels where angels fear to tread, reliability was not a problem. But there's a lot more to this story. One has to consider how smart these guys were and how mechanically brilliant they were as well. The car used mechanical fuel injection, and it used a Lenco 5-speed manual transmission hooked to the engine with a clutch. Allen and Ingersoll managed to develop what they called a mechanical brain in the fuel system to ramp the fuel volume up with RPM and manifold pressure. They built what is in effect a mechanical analog computer that does the same thing electronic fuel injection does today with the stroke of a key, but their system did it with a series of valves and reliefs that worked perfectly as the car was going down the racetrack. One of the things they needed to do was create a fuel curve that was almost inverse to what most other cars run. Usually, most cars are pretty fat down low and pretty lean up top in the RPM range, but it's incredible to think that these guys were able to invert that, create the perfect fuel curve that was lean early and fat late, and do it all without EFI helping in any way. Early on in this process, Buddy Ingersoll was told that the clutch-Lenko combination would never work, and he initially believed people, so he went with an automatic transmission and torque converter setup when the car first saw the track in 1985. After ballooning basically every torque converter they put in the car and blowing up every transmission they tried, he went back to his Lenko clutch program. One of the great mysteries of this car is how they got it to work off the starting line. With no ability to load the engine to help spool the turbo, and then twin turbos, these guys apparently figured out that if they leaned the engine hard enough early on the fuel side, the increased exhaust gas temperatures would help spool the turbos to get the car off the line. Once the car was moving through the first 60 feet, they would ramp up the boost and really ramp up the fuel volume. But remember, none of this was controlled electronically, it was all mechanical. Buddy Ingersoll took the secret of how to spool the engine up with no load on the starting line to his grave. I asked his son and contacted other people he raced with, and even they didn't have a clear-cut answer of how he figured it out. But as you can see in the photos, the car left very hard, and it did so free revving before Buddy dumped the clutch. Insane. The car would leave the starting line between 8,500 and 9,200 RPM and be shifted at 7,500 RPM according to Buddy himself. But remember, these things ran for hours in Indy cars, so big RPM bursts at the starting line or shifting were not as scary as sounding as you may initially think. With all this information in your back pocket, let's move to 1985 when the car was completed and placed on the track, because this is where the story really gets good and where a lot of people go totally wrong in their thoughts and assessments of the car's history. Upon its debut, the car was classified in the NHRA competition eliminator class as a double B altered. The machine weighed about 2,400 pounds and found itself running on the same 850 index as other cars with different shapes and sizes in the class. It didn't take long for other racers in the double B altered category to suffer turbo panic, so the Buick was placed in its own class, double B altered turbo. The big difference here was that the index was 8 seconds flat. Competition eliminator uses a handicap style start. The lower your index is, it means the faster you have to be to actually win rounds. Moving from an 850 index and double B altered to an 8 flat index and double B altered turbocharged effectively meant that to win rounds, the car would have to be worked much harder than before and really have to be about a half a second faster than it would have needed to be as a double B altered to win the same round against the same competition. Lacking other options, Ingersoll carried on unfazed. The initial version of this car in 1985 had a large single turbocharger that was mounted ahead of the engine, blowing through a homemade intercooler setup. By all accounts that I could find, it seems that this was a setup Ingersoll ran through the entire 1985 season. And while it would give way to a faster program, the single turbo was highly effective. It would show its effectiveness at the 1985 NHRA North Star Nationals in Brainerd, Minnesota. This was the event that truly put the turbo car on the map. Ripping off 770 runs at over 180 miles an hour and winning comp eliminator, he was within a tenth of a second of Bob Glidden's 760s that were winning pro stock rounds. This was the race and the moment of time specifically where the quote-unquote let him run pro stock movement began. The drag racing fan base was excited, the pro stock racers didn't give much thought to it. Buddy Ingersoll desperately wanted to run heads up, and it seemed like things would be working in his direction. 2 weeks later at the US Nationals, he would prove it again. At Indy in 1985, Ingersoll really let the old girl eat, and the world got one heck of a show. He qualified number 1, running more than a half a second under his index, reeling off 7-second passes, and most importantly, his qualifying elapsed time would have actually qualified him in the pro stock field. Ingersoll will go on to win that race in comp eliminator, the last national event win for the Buick, but that one event shot him into the drag racing limelight like never before. The car was not exceptionally consistent, nor was it exceptionally reliable, but when it worked like a charm. Even in 1985, had he been placed in pro stock, he probably wouldn't have won many rounds, but the rounds he did win, he would have won because of the horsepower the little V6 was making. After winning the US Nationals, the cries and screams of drag racing fans and other enthusiasts alike to get this car into pro stock grew even louder. Quick sidebar here. Believe it or not, Buddy Ingersoll was not the only guy with a turbocharged Buick in Competition Eliminator at this time, nor was he the quickest guy in competition with a turbocharged Buick at this time. That honor went to Garth Hill, driver of the Hill & Williams AA Altered Turbo. Remember, Buddy's heavier car was a double B Altered Turbo, which was effectively the same engine platform and execution, but it was in the Hill & Williams car using a band-embodied altered. This car spent years as the quickest and fastest Competition Eliminator car in history, having run a nasty 710 at 198 in the 1980s, before Hill & Williams decided to slow down, install an inline-6, and run F Econo Altered for the rest of their career. Their stripped-down Altered was another engineering marvel of the 1980s, and their performances were nothing short of stupefying to the general public. I asked Mark Ingersoll, Buddy Ingersoll's son, who raced with him at the time and continues to race today, if they raced with Hill & Williams or against them, and Ingersoll was very quick to say that they had nothing to do with the Hill & Williams program, and they were as tough competitors as anybody they ever raced. So now you know. And now back to our regularly scheduled Buick. By the end of the 1985 season, Buick, the drag racing public, and even Buddy Ingersoll himself had begun to openly lobby to be included in the NHRA Pro Stock category. Hot Rod Magazine reported that Buick had been in talks with the NHRA to let the car into Pro Stock for the 86 season. In the story, it states that all Buick had to do was file the appropriate paperwork with the NHRA. Ingersoll was quoted years later as saying that the team was given performance targets to hit for consideration in the class. They made the targets. Buick is to be a major sponsor of the NHRA moving forward, but the NHRA never approved the car for competition in Pro Stock. This is an important point because pretty much everybody will tell you the NHRA banned the car from Pro Stock, but the reality is it never once ran in the category, was never allowed to run in the category, and therefore was never banned for being in the category. The number of people who erroneously believe that this car was banned is crazy, but there's good reason for that. They're wrong about the sanctioning body and the fact that the NHRA banned it from Pro Stock, but they're not wrong about the fact that it was banned from a class called Pro Stock, which it was allowed to live in for a short while. That class was NHRA Mountain Motor Pro Stock. Since the early 1980s, the NHRA has mandated a 500 cubic inch limit for their Pro Stock program. It alleviated the need to factor engines and weights on a nearly week-to-week basis. NHRA went another way entirely. They said the cars had to be uniform in weight, but the engine size was unlimited, hence the birth of Mountain Motor Pro Stock. Thwarted by the NHRA, Ingersoll saw an opportunity at NHRA running in the heads-up Pro Stock category. The draw was exposure and the potential to sell sponsorship, which is very hard to do in sportsman categories like Competition Eliminator. Ted Jones, who was running the NHRA's competition department at the time and was a maverick thinker in drag racing, decided that he needed the car, popular as it was, to be part of his program. He figured it would be a good draw and he'd get to steal some headlines from the NHRA in the process. He sure got the draw and sure got the headlines, but they were not immediate in coming. For the 1986 season, Ingersoll had swapped from the monster single turbo ahead of his engine to much smaller twin turbos tucked down in a rearward location by the front tires. This moved significant weight off the nose of the car and into a better position to help the car launch. Ingersoll started the season with a wild intercooler setup that would inject liquid nitrogen and glycol into a sandwich plate on top of the 8 throttle bodies feeding the engine fuel. This was a unique and awesome setup, but eventually gave way to a pair of stock Grand National intercoolers that used a lot of ducting to get max efficiency. The car was fast as blazes with the twin turbos now because the chassis was able to work better, the intercooling was better, and he had a full season of experience to work off of. Though through the first 3 NHRA national events of the season, not much was going Ingersoll's way and he had no real ETs to brag about, there was some light at the end of the tunnel. He had a few occasional big numbers, but the round wins were very slow in coming. Then Buddy Ingersoll pulled into Bristol Dragway for a weekend that would change his life. The car that ran 770s in 1985 was now running 730s in 1986. He qualified his car with a 737 at 191 miles an hour. This little 268 cubic inch V6 was running against 700 cubic inch naturally aspirated V8s. The massive back half charge of the turbo beat the likes of Ricky Smith in the semifinals, and that's when things got spicy. That win placed Ingersoll one victory away from history and in exactly the wrong spot when it came to the rest of the Mountain Motor Pro Stock contingent. The final found him lined up next to Bob Glidden and off the starting line very well. It appeared Ingersoll was on the way to victory, but unfortunately he fried the clutch, and Bob Glidden by the slimmest of margins beat him in that final round. As one would expect, the racers freaked out, the sponsors freaked out, and all of that rolled right up to the doorstep of Ted Jones. Ted Jones, having to deal with the firestorm he had on his hands, made the one decision he could make. He He called Buddy Ingersoll the next week and told him the car was no longer allowed in NHRA Mountain Motor Pro Stock. One can blame the sponsors like Ford or others who were apparently freaking out, or the racers who were also freaking out, but one cannot blame Ingersoll, who had finally figured out what he had been trying years to do. So with its short NHRA career over, the machine went back to NHRA Comp Eliminator. Buick claimed they were going to submit the proper paperwork to have the car considered for Pro Stock, and there were varying reports as to whether or not that ever happened, stories of missed meetings, stories of vague promises that never came to pass. Here's a quote from a 1986 Hot Rod magazine article on Buddy Ingersoll and the car. He says, "I've got to run Pro Stock. There's no sponsorship in comp, and this car cost a fortune to run. I can't run points meets any more than pro cars can. The tracks are too slick because they don't get enough use, and I can't get the car hooked up. When the turbo loads hard in high gear, the torque just blows the tires away, and I have to get out of it. I can go 770s all day on a good track at a national event, but a 798 is the best pass I made at a points meet all season long." The complications of allowing this car into Pro Stock were many. Beyond the fact that there would have to be immediate factoring and weight changes made for the turbocharged cars versus the naturally aspirated cars, there was another and potentially larger element involved. Pontiac, Chevrolet, Ford, and Oldsmobile had all invested in their own big block cylinder head programs for NHRA Pro Stock in this era. One could do some quick math to determine that they were not enthusiastic to see those expensive efforts throttled by Buick, who had not invested resources in the class, but had a car that would show up in clean house. Needless to say, no true formal discussion was ever had to allow this car into NHRA Pro Stock that involved the manufacturer or anybody beyond internal executives. What few people remember is that Buddy Ingersoll had a second turbocharged Buick that debuted for the 1987 season. This was a far more aerodynamic and frankly oddball Buick Somerset Regal that was the weapon of choice that year. I'm not sure I've ever actually seen a road-going version of a Buick Somerset Regal, but it sure makes a good-looking Pro Stock style race car. The car began with a Don Hardy chassis that was then modified by Illinois chassis builder Larry Lamzik. With the identical engine combination from the Regal and the improved chassis and aerodynamics, the car immediately went into the 720s, running 729 at 194 miles an hour. His efforts to run NHRA Pro Stock thwarted, NHRA not even entertaining the conversation anymore, Ingersoll seemed stuck and broke. This was a brand new car with all this potential that was going to be parked and set aside. That until Gale Banks stepped up and provided much needed sponsorship money for the rest of the season. The payoff was that at Indy in 1987, Buddy made the quickest and fastest door slammer pass in NHRA history at that time. The Regal Somerset managed a monstrous 724 at 198.23 miles an hour. Suddenly, the ultimate goal of the season became getting the car to run 200. Earlier in that same year, Bill Coleman had broken the 200-mile-an-hour barrier in a door slammer in March with a huge nitrous engine. 200 miles an hour in a full-bodied car was still incredibly rare territory, and the guys wanted to flirt with it and then blast through it using a V6. Ingersoll would run the rest of the season in NHRA Competition Eliminator, chasing 200 miles per hour the whole way. The car would eventually run 200 and mark the end of the Turbo Buick section of Buddy Ingersoll's career. Ingersoll went on to become a very good crew chief for a number of racing teams, working with the likes of Warren Johnson and many others. Buddy passed away in 2012, but his drag racing legacy looms large as his son Mark is one of the most brilliant minds in the NHRA pits, tuning Erica Enders to her 6th Pro Stock World Championship in 2023, adding another notch to a career belt that already has many in it. While it is true that Buddy Ingersoll never got to race NHRA Pro Stock, one must know that he's smiling somewhere seeing this son reigning over it as one of the great crew chiefs the class has ever seen. So now you know the story of Buddy Ingersoll and his turbocharged Buicks. Not one, but two. Not banned by NHRA, but IHRA. And not just impressive for their time, but impressive for all time. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more cool automotive history.